Hello students, hope you are fine. We are discussing the course Guidance and Counseling, and now we have entered in the week 4 and the lecture number is 4 of this week 4, and today we are going to discuss non-directive counseling approach. Yesterday we have discussed the directive counseling approach in detail. Today we are going to discuss non-directive counseling approach of the counseling. Let us start our discussion by elaborating the highlights of this lecture. We will introduce the topic first of all, and then we will try to understand the concept of the man, because this approach is related to the individual and we need to understand the concept of the man. Characteristics of the client-centered counseling we will elaborate, and then we will try to understand what are the steps of non-directive counseling, and we will also discuss the limitations as well as the advantages of the non-directive counseling, and then finally we will conclude our lecture. Let us start with the discussion. Carl Ranson Rogers, one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, developed this client-centered counseling, which is also called non-directive counseling. So Rogers later termed his approach person-centered counseling to reflect the fact that his theory could be applied to all interactions among people and not just to those between client and therapist. This idea of client-centered approach can be applied to any situations. Non-directive counseling concept came prominently in view in 1942 with the release of the Carl Rogers book Counseling and Psychotherapy. It was a very famous work of the Carl Rogers, in which he has elaborated the concept of the non-directive counseling. He did not accept the behaviorist view that man is just like a machine which can be manipulated in any way the therapist desired. Okay, man is basically a human being. He is not a machine which can be handled by the person who is having the knowledge of that. He also rejected the Freudian view that man is irrational being and is controlled by his unconscious. Okay, he or she is being controlled by the repressed desires of the which are present in the unconscious level. He is also against to that concept. Rogers' theory basically emphasized the importance of subjective interactions between the counselors and the counselee. Subjective interactions mean where emotions are involved, where interests are involved, where attitudes are given significance. So, in addition to the intellectual aspect, this approach is basically more oriented towards the subjective interactions between the client and the counselor. The first-hand experience of the interview, the interviewer's experience as well as clients becomes the breeding ground for the insights and hypotheses about the nature of the helping relationship. So, interaction between the client and the counselor play a very significant role, because counselor with the cooperation of the students discuss the issues and the problems, and they finally reach out to any conclusion, or counselor basically assists the individual in making his or her own decisions. What is the concept of man? The concept of man, Rogers' theory is based on the certain beliefs and assumptions regarding the conception of human being. What is basically the concept of man as elaborated by the Rogers theory? He says that there are 5 important aspects which must be correlated to the concept of the man, and the number 1 is that belief in democratic ideal. We will explain it later on. Fundamental predominance of the subjective is another aspect, and tendency towards actualization and man is trustworthy, man is wiser than his intellect. These are the 5 principles which have been explained by the Rogers. He says, believes in democratic ideals. Democracy talks about the freedom, democracy talks about the equal opportunity, and democracy talks about every individual is important and he or she must be given significance in learning process and in counseling process also. Fundamental predominance of the subjective. Individuals, although have their intellectual abilities, and the objective aspect is also associated to that, but attitudes, emotions are also very important, and they must be given significance to understand the real nature of the human beings. Tendency towards self-actualization. Every individual, irrespective of his abilities and the capabilities, possess this tendency to become self-actualized in his or her life as per the potentials given by the God to each and every individual. So, actualization is basically achieving the highest potentials in his or her life, or achieving to the maximum limit. Man is trustworthy. We can trust to the human beings, trust their abilities, trust their opinions, trust their attitudes, and trust their selection of the goals and aspiration level and the motivation level. We need to demonstrate trust in the human beings, and man is wiser than his intellect. Means he is not only having intellectual aspect, but the affective domain or the and psychomotor domain are also important. Only cognitive aspect is not going to solve the problem. Other aspects are equally important. So this is the concept as elaborated by them. Now we are coming to the characteristics of the client-centered counseling. Some peculiar characteristic features of client-centered counseling have been highlighted here on the basis of analysis of this approach. The aim is to assist the individual to grow and gain independence. Here, assistance is provided, and this assistance, the purpose of this assistance is basically to develop the independence, characteristics, features of the independence among the learners or among the client. The quality of the relationship between counselor and the client is the maximum important. The relationship is the heart of the therapy. Here, a very subjective approach is utilized, and the rapport is developed with the client by the counselor, and the cordial and cooperative relationship which is maintained between the client and the counselor is given significance in this therapy. And here the relationship or the interview or the having aware to the issues and the problems of the students, on allowing the individual to express his or her views is the core of this philosophy or core of this counseling technique. There is an element of subjectivity within this relationship, as there is considerable freedom for expressing feelings. When the person is given freedom to express his or her own views, then he elaborates many aspects, and there can be subjectivity involved in that. Some may be useful or some may not be fruitful for the student, but he is given ample freedom to express their ideas, to present their point of view, and to elaborate their inner and as well as outer feelings to the counselor. Another characteristic feature is there is no mechanical, objective, routine set of procedures to observe this approach. We don't follow any objective criteria or routine set to implement this technique. It varies from situation to the situation. The emotional aspects of the relationship are far more important than the intellectual aspect, as emotions play a significant role in establishing relationship. There can never be any relationship without giving significance to the affective domain or subjective or emotional aspects of the individual personality. So this is the core of this client-centered counseling. Okay, emotional aspects are given significant, and emotional expression of the individual dealing with their problem, dealing with their issues, and expressing their positives and the negative is significant on the part of the counselor. Another characteristic feature is that feeling of the client are paramount, and the feelings of the counselors are equally significant as they contribute the relationship and stimulate client growth. Feelings of the client are important. What he thinks, what type of opinion he or she expresses, and the feelings of the counselors are also very important. And this emotional attachment between the client and a good rapport created between the client and the counselor is the key for this counseling. This is characteristic feature. Another is immediate situation is the focus of attention. Historical events of the past and prognosis for the future receive little significance. What is the problem at the hand? We have to take into consideration and resolve that issue in order to analyze and having more concern about the past events, because this is this kind of client-centered counseling is associated to the present situations. The client assumes considerable personality for himself in therapy and in the decisions he makes. Client is considered basically good and trustworthy. So responsibility basically is assumed by the individual, and we consider that the opinion and the analysis of the problem from different point of view done by the individual is maybe good or is always on a right direction. That is why we demonstrate trust in the opinion of the students. Giving advice, making interpretations, and diagnosis as generally defined have no place, as these limit the client's freedoms and may threaten rather than aid his growth. So these are basically the characteristic features of the client counselor-centered counseling rather than client-centered counseling. So we are not giving the advice to the student. The counselor is not making interpretations, neither he is in the process of the diagnosis, because these are the characteristic features of the individual-centered counseling or the counselor-centered counseling, and here they are not given significance because they limit the ability of the student to make his or her own decisions. Freedom of thoughts, expression, and individual responsibility mark the client-centered approach. Freedom is given, total freedom is given. Nothing is right and wrong. Expression of ideas is very important. So counseling is regarded as an activity distinct from other educational, medical, and sociological services. It is quite different from these services. Both flexibility and limits characterize the client-centered approach. Client-centered. Okay, we are flexible in our approach. We also set certain limits because we have to reach to the conclusion also, but flexibility is given to the individual to deliberate their problem, to understand their issues. Another characteristic feature is that the principal aim of the client-centered counseling is to help the student see himself or herself the way he really is, and to change his concept of self to conform to the reality. Whatever perspective the individual is having about himself or the herself, he has to change that and he has to make it correlated to the reality of the life. This is basically very important in the counseling process. The chief purpose of the counselor is to reflect the feelings of the client. This is the analytical aspect on the part of the counselor. Okay, he or she has to make the interpretation of the feelings of the client. He must be able to understand the feelings and comprehend the feelings in order to reach to certain objective conclusions related to that. Changes in self concept always bring changes in behavior. Some may be life changes. The very basic objective is basically to see or ensure the changes in the behavior of the student. If these behavior changes are taking place, they can be very beneficial in the change of the entire life or the goals of the students. Client-centered counseling demonstrates an implicit faith in the powers of the client to make a resolution of his own difficulties. If he is allowed to examine himself freely without defensiveness, if total freedom is given to the students or the individual or the client, then and we are showing the trust and respect to the dignity and faith in their abilities to make adequate judgment for themselves and to resolve their conflicts and solve their problem. That is important in this counseling. It encourages self-expression, self-awareness, self-development, and a greater understanding of the self. As I said in previous characteristic feature, self-actualization is basically the goal in any counseling approach, and more importantly in client-centered counseling approach. Okay, we are encouraging the self-expression by giving them adequate freedom or optimum freedom to express their ideas and opinions and express their emotions related to the situation, related to the problem, related to their characteristic features, and they are also trying to understand their own personality related to their positives and the negative. They are introspecting their own self or own personality, that is self-awareness and self-development. If there is a need to develop that self, to make it consonance with the reality of the life, that is also given significance and a greater understanding of the self. In this matter, we are basically developing the greater understanding among our client or the person to whom we are implementing the concept of client-centered counseling. Now, there are certain steps which we need to take while we are engaged in the non-directive counseling process. Carl Rogers suggested the following steps to be significant in implementation of this technique, and these steps are defining the problematic situation. Another step is free expression of feelings, and then analysis of the positives and the negative feelings, and development of the insight is the latter stage, and termination of the counseling situation is the last stage or the last step of this non-directive counseling. What are these defining the problematic situation? If we look into the details of it, then we can say that the first task of the counselor is to define the problematic situation after seeing it from all angles. All angles. Problems are there, and you are dealing the problems of the student, and you are adopting the client-centered approach. Client-centered approach, where client is more important. So, first task of the counselor is to define the problematic situation after seeing it from all angles. The purpose is not to find out the solution of the problem, but to provide a place, an atmosphere in which the client can think of the solutions of his problem, can think of the solution of the problem. So, we are providing basically an environment where we are discussing the problem from different point of views, from its different consequences, from its different factors which can affect on that, and we are making students aware about that. So defining the problematic situation is the first step in ensuring the counseling process. Free expression of feelings. The counselor allows ample freedom to the client to freely express his or her feelings regarding the problem in a purely democratic atmosphere. He demonstrates trust in the abilities of the client to take independent decisions. This is the basic aspect or prime motive of this counseling technique, client-centered counseling technique. Here, or non-directive counseling technique, we are giving ample freedom to students to express their feelings and their ideas. When the students or the client is expressing his problem, feelings, then many clues can get by the counselor about the issues and about the problem. If we are not giving that opportunity to discuss, then their feelings can be repressed and the person will not be express their personality characteristic features before the counselor. So this freedom is very important because human beings are having the ability to manipulate the situations. They can respond much better in an environment which is created on the basis of the trust and giving confidence and total freedom to our student. The free expression of feelings is second step. Now analysis of the positives and negative feelings. That is the next stage. The counselor tries to understand the feelings of the client and recognizes a positive as well as negative feelings. There are positive feelings, there are negative feelings, and understanding of those feelings in the light of the problem is important. The counselor, being trained in the task of counseling, is able to categorize the positive and the negative feeling. Take for example the student expressing the very positives and the negative feelings related to the issues, related to the problem. Counselor, being an expert of the field, now he is understanding the feelings from the point of view of assisting the individual or analyzing the positive feelings and the negative feelings, and he or she is categorizing or making effort to categorize these feelings. Development of the insight is the next stage. After having all kinds of expressions of the opinions, now we get an idea about the characteristic features of the student and the various aspects related to the problem. The period of free expression and classification of the positives and the negative feeling is followed by gradual development of insight. Gradual development of insight as the client recognizes and accepts emotionally as well as intellectually his or her real attitudes and desires, and he perceives the decision that he or she must make and the positive course of action open to him. Here the client recognizes and accepts emotionally as well as intellectually to develop insight where he or she is in a position to take the correct or appropriate decisions to resolve his issues and the problems, or to confront with the problem and resolve it with the cooperation of the counselor. Next stage is termination of the counseling situation. Development of insight leads to positive steps towards the solution of the problem. When insight is developed, problem solving ability is developed, and the person is in a position to complete the task of solution of the problem, then the next stage comes. We are entering in a stage where termination of the counseling situation takes place. So client demonstrates confidence in taking right decision to solve the problem. Insight is developed. The client has taken the decision to solve his problem, or that is implementing, and he or she is satisfied with that insight, and his behavior change is reflected. This is basically the stage. The decreased need for help is felt, and either the counselor or the client decides to terminate the counseling situation. Once the problem is solved, then definitely there is no further need of the counseling. Yes, there can be a follow-up activity at any stage later on, but here we are terminating the counseling. There are certain limitations of the non-directive counseling. The serious limitation or a serious weakness of the theory of general counseling is that it speaks little about the role of information in assisting the client in self-actualization process. We are not providing the information based on evaluation of certain application of the test. So, general counseling is that it speaks little about the role of the information in assisting the client in self-actualization process. The approach emphasizes the effective determinants of behavior, ignoring the importance of cognitive and rational aspects of the human being. Reasoning says that we have to ensure what are the characteristic features of the students, what are the qualities of the student, what are the personality types of the student, and these qualities must be known clear to the student for making that decision. And this counseling approach is not adopting this method. That is the weakness of it. The client-centered counselor does not set specific goals for the counseling, whereas many other counseling approaches do. Here the role of the counselor is passive, and the person who is supposed to be professionally trained, he is playing a passive role, and the person who is indulged in many kinds of the problem, he is given more significance. So sometimes, and some people consider it is a negative aspect or the limitation of this non-directive counseling technique. The counselor does not set forth specific problem solutions or specific behavior changes as the goal of the counseling. The problems and the goals are set by the client rather than the counselor. Thus, the counseling approach makes the task of the counselor passive rather than active. It is quite clear in entire process of the non-directive counseling, the role of the counselor is passive and the role of the client is active. We are giving more significance to the student rather than the counselor. Counselor is a puppet in the hands of the students. Another limitation is that client-centered counseling does not find diagnosis and appraisal of the test or other means to be useful in counseling. Rather, it considers diagnosis a waste of time. Although it is very important for having a rational decision, but this philosophy of non-directive counseling is against this principle. It does not consider the category of individuals who accept little responsibility for their problem. Okay. There are individuals. It does not consider the category of individuals who accept little responsibility for their problems. Means if students are not showing the responsibility to solve their problems, then how this counseling technique will be applicable to that? It has the same goal for all the clients for achieving the self-actualization. This general goal does not take into account the individual needs of the clients. It is another limitation of the non-directive counseling. Client-centered counseling theory does not care how the behavior is affected by a stimulus situation and the nature of the environment. There are many factors which influence the personality, characteristic features of the individual and which are related to the cause of the problem, and this non-directive counseling technique does not take into account the historical aspect. Rather, it is more concerned with the immediate aspect or the problems in hand. Being time consuming, its application in all schools is not possible. It is not possible to implement in all these schools because it is so complicated, and it is directed in favor of the student. Then it is not possible to use it because it is time consuming. This counseling approach expects the counselor to be neutral and not communicate own values to the client. However, it is extremely difficult to be neutral, value free, unbiased in interpersonal relation between the counselor and the client. It is natural if two people are interacting with each other, emotionally involved with each other, then how the one is not influencing the wish or opinion of the other. So it is not possible to be free from exercising any influence by the counselor in non-directive counseling. Now there are certain advantages of the non-directive counseling. Client empowerment. Definitely non-directive counseling emphasizes the client's capacity for self-healing and problem solving. We give significance to the students. The counselor acts as facilitator. The task of the counselor is facilitator, not director, guiding the client to explore their own thoughts and feelings without imposing solution. The client is basically given freedom to explore their own thoughts and the feelings and reach out to any solution. This empowers the client to take responsibility for their choices and actions. It gives more power to the client, and that is why it is giving significance to the client empowerment. Increase self-awareness and understanding. By providing a space for open and honest self-expression in a free and frank environment, non-directive counseling helps clients gain deeper insights into their emotions, their behaviors, and patterns. This heightened self-awareness can be a powerful catalyst for personal growth and positive change. If students are increasing their self-awareness and understanding, then they feel more confident and they feel more growth in their personality. Improved self-esteem is basically another characteristic features. A non-judgmental and accepting environment created by the counselor helps client feel valued and respected. This can lead to increased self-confidence and a more positive self-feeling. So our self-esteem is enhanced if we feel that we are given significance, our opinions are given significance, and our directions are being accepted. Then fosters independence. As I said in previous aspect also, the focus of self-discovery and problem solving is a non-directive counseling encourages clients to become more independent and self-reliant. They learn to trust their own judgment and make decisions that are aligned with their values. So whatever decisions students are taking, they are developing their independence. They consider their opinion more significant, and this is a kind of enhancing their self-esteem or independence to the maximum limit. Creates a safe and supportive environment. Non-directive counseling prioritizes creating a safe and trusting therapeutic relationship. This allows clients to feel comfortable expressing their vulnerability and exploring difficult emotions without fear of judgment. So creates a safe and supportive environment. It is a positive aspect where students feel comfortable to present their views and opinion. Focus on the present. This counseling approach is more concerned with the present situation. Non-directive counseling primarily focuses on the client's current situation and how they are experiencing it. This allows for more immediate and practical problem solving rather than engaging in the past. The present is more important that is given more significance in the non-directive counseling. It is quite flexible because non-directive approach can be adapted to suit the individual needs and preferences of the client. It is flexible model that can be used in various settings and with diverse populations. So flexibility is the key because we are making adjustment as per the needs of the students or the client, as per the problems of the clients, and at different stages no conformity is adopted, rather flexibility is granted to reach out the adequate insight to take decisions on the part of the student. Let us conclude our lecture. Non-directive counseling, also known as client-centered or person-centered counseling. Non-directive counseling, also called client-centered or person-centered counseling, is a therapeutic approach or healing approach where the client leads the session and the counselor acts as supportive guide rather than a director. He is not directing, he is just supporting, he is playing a role of the guide, and he is participating in the process of the counseling but giving more significance to the individual, his wishes and his desires. The counselor focuses on creating an environment for the client to explore their problems and find their own solutions through skillful listening and encouragement. That is the key of this counseling process. So counselor focuses on creating an environment. Here environment is more important for the client to explore their problems and find their own solutions. They have to explore their problem and they have to find their own solution through skillful listening and encouragement. Listening means interaction between the client and the counselor. So it is quite different from the counselor oriented counseling as we discussed in our previous. It is totally contrast to that type of counseling. Thank you. So with this we have completed our lecture and thanks for your patience listening. God bless you all.